Thank you very much. I wasn't sure that I should be the one that gives this talk, but let me just say at the beginning that I've borrowed heavily from a number of good talks I've heard recently from people like Jordan Feld and other people, so I want to acknowledge them at the beginning and acknowledge them at the end. Coming from Edmonton, the University of Alberta, as a dean, that's a very important thing to do early on, to acknowledge where you got your information. Let me just say the key points that I want to do is that there has been tremendous progress leading to successful treatment. The current therapies are curative of this disease in nearly everyone that's going to be treated, and the therapy continues to improve. Curative therapy is just the first step. Many people feel that it's all over, we got great curative therapy, but it's just the first step. It is time for strong policy. We need to seek, we need to test, we need to treat, and do not forget the marginalized populations. And elimination requires more than good drugs, requires leadership, commitment, energy, passionate support, resources, and a strong national policy. And if you think we can't do this in hepatitis C, we should be looking at HIV, where Canada has had a tremendous impact. And there's no reason that Canada can't have a similar impact in hepatitis C. Let's think about diseases and the principles of disease elimination or eradication. Eradication is a very bold term that means you're going to eradicate the disease so there's no infectious disease in a global host population. That's not realistic for this disease, given the worldwide distribution and the number of people. Elimination means you've got a region that you want to eliminate this disease, and it really is a stretch goal, but it is a realistic goal for a country like Canada. Control is the reduction of the disease, prevalence, and decreasing mortality and morbidity. There are only 2 diseases that we have eliminated or eradicated in the world, smallpox and rinderpest. There are several other diseases that are targets, but I want you to look at the regional elimination. And in regional elimination, a number of these diseases have been eliminated by drugs alone, so that it is possible with the drugs, with the epidemiology, and a therapy to eliminate this disease. The global burden of HIV is about 170 million people worldwide, or about 2 to 3% of the world's population. And the annual rate and disease burden has continued to increase. As you see the mortality of HIV going down, we see the mortality and morbidity of hepatitis C increasing. And most of these people, about 86% in Canada, are treated, where very few of the hepatitis C patients are being treated. If you look at the disease burden of infectious diseases in Canada and why we should all be looking at this as a real target, is hepatitis C is the most common infectious disease causing loss of years of life and loss of work of all of these infectious diseases. Now, how would you say that it is possible to eliminate this disease? Well, you can see in the red is really the incidence and how the incidence has dramatically come down. The F1 is in the blue, F0 in red, F2 in green, F3 in orange, magenta is the F4, then cirrhosis and end-stage decompensated cirrhosis. And these diseases the prevalence is decreasing. And this is a disease that I think government and others, all of us, should really relish in the opportunity to accelerate the elimination of this disease. And we don't need to see it continue to increase. And the costs associated with this, the black line that comes over to this side, is projected in the US to go to about $8 billion a year. But you can see the cost is primarily around decompensated cirrhosis, hepatocellular carcinoma, and transplantation. Of course, the reason for this happening is the discovery of the virus, and the discovery of the virus leading to diagnostic tests that made our blood much safer, made our epidemiology understandable, and dramatically changed and declined the incidence of this disease. So this is a disease in decline, but we still have the sequelae increasing from that epidemic. I just thought it was worthwhile to look briefly at the key steps in the whole evolution of what has happened in this disease. We started out with people recognizing non-A, non-B hepatitis, and that there was another form of hepatitis. We saw that this non-A, non-B could be transmitted to animals in the early 1980s. In 1990s, 89, 90, the virus was discovered. That was the key breakthrough. And then you can see the other key steps as you move along. But a number of people in this room and a number of people have gone to meetings for the last 21 years since the virus is discovered, and they've come up with the key targets. The first protease inhibitor was Boehringer Ingelheim. Daniel Lemaire was very much involved with that. And finally, we get up to licensing of the first direct antivirals in 2011, and now the new antivirals. And 2014 and 15, we are headed to cure with non-interferon antiviral agents. I should say that the progress in this was made by academia in the beginning, and I want to acknowledge industry, patients, clinician scientists, research nurses that have made this really possible in the last few years to see great clinical trials coming out with really outstanding results. You can't do this alone with research grants. You have to have industry, and industry is very much involved in the final successes. Most of these results over those years have been reported at the International International Symposium of Hepatitis C and Related Viruses. And a little plug here that we are hosting in Banff this year the 21st International Conference. And the theme of this is From Discovery to Cure. And I think it's a nice time to celebrate what has really happened in the field. The key targets, of course, have been identified, but the real inhibitors that I think are most important are the protease inhibitors, the polymerase inhibitors, and the NS5 inhibitors. As there. And these three groups are going to lead us to interferon-free therapy rapidly. If you look at the therapy, very early on, interferon alone, minimal results that showed that there was some benefit, and then we added in the protease inhibitors, and no doubt these were major advances. But the major advances come at a cost. The pill burden was high. There was requirements of food with some of these. There was drug interactions and metabolite interactions. We've seen anemia like we've never seen before, and using these protease inhibitors with pegylated interferon ribavirin. We've seen some severe skin rashes and others. The two drugs that have just been licensed, samipivir and spofivir, have been used in combination in the Cosmos trial without interferon or with ribavirin, and all I will say is that across here you can see tremendous responses to these antiviral agents. And it's continuing to see in different studies virtually 100% cures. And many different companies are bringing forward their compounds that are going to bring a lot of choice in this whole antiviral therapy. So we've moved from the first generation of direct antivirals with pegylated interferon to second generation, still with pegylated interferon, but we're headed to interferon-free with tremendous results. Another very important observation is the fact that when we get a sustained response, it is a sustained response that is durable. These patients that have been followed that have sustained viral responses remain free of the virus for long periods of time. And the benefits of sustained viral responses are that they do save lives. If you look across the first one, it's looking at the antivirals having an effect on liver disease, and overall mortality is decreased in these patients that are able to release the virus. Hepatocellular carcinoma is markedly reduced. However, not completely reduced, and there is still some longer-term follow-up and monitoring of these patients even after they have a sustained viral response. We don't know, we need to know more about that and how long we need to follow them. Disease, excuse me, hepatitis. Hepatitis induces cirrhosis. We used to think that cirrhosis was irreversible, but early on in the treatments of hepatitis B, we saw examples, as shown here with the full-blown cirrhosis in a patient on lamivudine for 2.5 years, showing a reversal on biopsy of the cirrhotic disease. And in hepatitis B, about 70% of the patients that are on waiting lists for liver transplants come off the waiting list with reversal of cirrhosis with good antiviral therapy. And the same thing is happening with hepatitis C. We are seeing that it's not a one-way street. There is some reversal of this with antiviral therapy, and repeat biopsies after sustained viral responses showing greater than 50% improved, and this I think will continue to improve with time. So when we've got great therapy, this is from the New England Journal of Medicine just this last year, showing that of 100 people in the US with this disease, we diagnose about 50% of them. They're referred for care, about 30%. Have hepatitis R testing, about 20 to 30%, and treated and cured. We are not curing nearly enough of these patients. We're not seeing enough of those patients, and we're not, this is not good enough, obviously. And the results in Canada are somewhat similar. And so why are they so low? Patients unaware that they have their infection. How important is it to screen and find this disease now that we've got a treatment and now that we have a potential to cure? Many patients don't want treatment because they've heard of the difficulties of going through this therapy. And I see patients in clinics, and very often they simply turn down the therapy because they've had a friend on interferon, ribavirin, or other treatments that have been very difficult. In this training program, we are supposed to bring postdocs or students into the clinics, and I can remember bringing some of them in to my clinic, and the thing that surprised them the most was how often we'd see a patient that we could treat, but there was no way of treating because of the cost of the medication and the lack of coverage. Many people with this disease are in the group of people that have some social difficulties, injustices, and frequently work in menial jobs and simply can't afford the therapy. We have to find ways to make this better. Doctors, poor awareness of it, late to diagnose and treat. There's few treaters. And the debate later today will talk about, can family physicians take over and manage this treatment? And I think it's an evolving debate, because as we see therapies that become much easier to deliver without side effects, we will see more and more people delivering this therapy in primary care settings. I don't want to upbeat or take on that debate, but I think that that will happen. The real problem is underdiagnosed and undertreatment. In wealthy countries, they say about 50% are actually diagnosed. United States, they say 72%, France, 50%. Canada, they say only 21% in 2007 were undiagnosed. I don't know where we are dreaming of, but this is not true. We have much higher number of patients that are undiagnosed. And as we know, the screening of the baby boomers is an example. In resource-poor countries, the figures are much more discouraging. Minimal data, but few late diagnoses. And in Canada, less than 15% of our patients, and probably under 10% of our patients, are actually being treated. It makes a difference if you screen and you do a search. And these in the orange colored just indicates seek and treat versus when you do not seek and treat. And many countries, seek and treating is clearly increasing the number of people that we get sustained viral responses and better outcomes. So we need to seek and treat populations for screening. Transfusion history. I still see patients coming into the clinic, people that are very intelligent, who've had transfusions in the 1970s, for one reason or other, never been screened, come into the clinic with rather late disease. Birth cohort. We know that birth cohort, 1945 to 1965 or 1975, I don't care what you want to argue, but we know that the incidence in this group is 3 times higher than the general population. So we need to find out who they are and offer them treatment if appropriate. People who inject drugs. You're going to hear a lot about this. People in prisons, different cultural backgrounds, particularly the Aboriginal population, where we know we have a higher incidence of this disease, probably between 3 and 5%, compared to about 1%, 1.2 or 3 in Canada. Immigrants as well have a higher rate. The best studies in Canada have been done in BC on the monitoring. I believe that's by the best studies. And Mel Krasden studies indicate that as of 2011, HCV prevalence in BC, baby boomers, is 2 times higher in the tested population than the general population. And 74% of the cohort still remained unscreened in a province that's done the most active screening. So how we came up with 21% unscreened, I don't know. And boomers remain undiagnosed still. And just at the bottom, you can see the differences in the baby boomers and the BC population, the general population, and the testing. But critically important is that baby boomers. In the developed world and the undeveloped world, you can see the differences. And people who use drugs are core transmitters. And if we're going to bring this epidemic under control, we have to have a better approach to finding, retaining, and treating this group of patients. We also have the sex trade, where there is transmission is lower, but certainly occurs, and the general population, which has had transfusions or has been infected with drugs and used drugs casually in the 1970s and 80s. They are not high transmitters, but they are the large portion of patients with the disease, and they are the group that, of course, needs to be screened and treated appropriately. Another key thing is that there are social networks in these people who use drugs. And when you do the tight tracing, you can find there are individuals that are high transmitters that affect a lot more, a higher portion of people. And if we're going to look at the potential of treatment for cure, these are the critical people that we need to get and treat. And if we can break this type of a network of people that are exchanging blood through patients and injecting drugs, we can change this quite dramatically in a short period of time. And this is another slide that just shows from Edinburgh that if you can scale up the treatment of these patients, this is 10 per thousand, 20 per thousand, 40 per thousand, or 80 per thousand of the patients who use drugs annually, you can see what you can do to the transmission network and dropping the incidence of this disease, a new disease, very rapidly. People in jails. Let me just say that the United States has the highest incineration rate in the world. It's or a very high incineration rate. This is comes from the HepDART meeting, but just I thought it was very interesting to see that there are approximately, in the United States, 1 million people in prisons who have hepatitis C. They make up a group that is the high transmitter group. They also make up the group about 1/3 of the total hepatitis C burden in the United States. And in the United States, in 1976, they passed a Supreme Court decision that people in the jails or in prisons needed to be treated fairly, and this is where they come up with the cruel and unusual punishment to withhold medical therapy. So there is some hope that there are laws supporting the treatment of these people. Canada's incineration rate is much lower. We have about 14,000 people in prisons in Canada, and our rates are lower. We do have, Corrections Canada is to provide medical care that every inmate deserves, essential health care. Is hepatitis C part of treatment of hepatitis C part of essential health care? I think it is for the patient's benefit. I think it is for if we're going to get a handle on this epidemic. And treatment, chronic hepatitis C is important in the Canadian prisons as well, and in the group that get into the communities after time in prison. Correction populations have ranged the incidence of hepatitis C from 23 to 86% in various studies across the country. And there's been very little emphasis on treating this group. Canada's federal correction settings, important opportunity to reach and treat many of these patients that are high transmitters. Effective treatment can be achieved in this patient group and be very high success rates. Every effort should be made to treat them, and the team approach to that treatment has been very effective. In case you hold out hope, our government has zero tolerance for policy for drugs in our institutions. I hope this is IV illicit drugs rather than hepatitis C drugs. Patients who use drugs, and this is some studies from Australia, but just to show you that from Jason Grebley's, that 80% of them are willing to have therapy, and about 1-2% in Australia actually get therapy. So we have to do much better. There are other populations with hepatitis C that need to be recognized that I don't think we've talked about very much. And this population includes the pediatric patients, because none of these clinical trials, or very few of the clinical trials, have been conducted in pediatric patients that I've seen, and the issue of vertical transmission. Although we've always said the vertical transmission is very low, let me just show you some statistics on this. 14 people in the age groups of 0 to 14 years make up in various parts of the world 12 to 50% of the world's population. Worldwide, 7 billion people, currently 160, 170 million with HCV. The births worldwide, about 131 million births per year. 3 million are to people who carry hepatitis C positive mothers. In the US, there's about 5 million hepatitis C positives and about 94,000 births per year. With the transmission rates of 5 to 6%, we are bringing into cohort 5,000 to 6,000 in the US every year, 500-600 in Canada every year, who are hepatitis C positive children. We have not done as much work in children, mainly because we think the disease is mild, the drugs are expensive, but this is changing. And the drugs will be safe in children, easier to tolerate. And this just shows the importance of treating children. Biopsies 6 years apart, 29% showed an increase in fibrosis. So this disease, long-term, we think is mild in children, but the longer you carry it, the more likely you will have sequelae. And hepatitis C, children with hepatitis C are 26 times as likely to have liver disease long-term. The current treatment is effective. Infants, let me just say that we don't even question screening for metabolic diseases. And metabolic diseases occur in about 15 per 100,000 babies that we screen. If you were to screen hepatitis C, 130 babies would be positive out of 100,000. Nobody questions screening for metabolic disease. Nobody screens regularly the babies or infants for hepatitis C and try to prevent it. It is a preventable disease. When you think of what happened with HIV, what's happened with hepatitis B, and how we've prevented vertical transmission, we need to now, with the new drugs, really look at, can we use some drugs safely during pregnancy and decrease the vertical transmission and cut out that cohort as well. The government's position, it costs what? This is a slide, thank you, Jordan. Limitations of access both here, European countries. Access is not universal. Many populations with no or very limited access to therapy. IV drug users, immigrants, those without insurance, those with private drug plans, makes up 80%, without private drugs, about 80% of the population with HCV, the major limitation in Canada. Resource limited countries, it's even much worse, of course. Drugs are expensive. And why are they expensive? It costs to discover and develop these drugs. We've seen this going on for the last 10 years. They're coming to market, but we've heard about them being developed. The cost of acquisition. If you look at what happened with Pharmacet, 11.9 billion buyout by Gilead in getting access to sabofovir. But however, there are many drugs in development. Only a few survive long term, and I think that companies feel they have to get some recovery out of their investment when they have the opportunity. But there are drugs for treatment are expensive, but so is disease. Drug costs will come down. I think we will see competition and volume buying, etc. We should be able to bring the prices down. And we can get lessons from HIV, AIDS, where we've seen the costs of these drugs come down over time quite dramatically. Just remember the annual costs of drugs to treat these diseases, the hepatitis C and the complications, is high, particularly the decompensated cirrhosis, liver failure, liver cancer, transplantation, and even the annual after the transplantation. And if we look at what's going to happen with this epidemic, I showed you the epidemic is waning and going to go down, but the costs as a result of that epidemic are still increasing until 2030. We have an opportunity to interrupt this with the new therapies as they've come out. And it really means that we have to seek, find, develop policies to do this. We tend to focus on the cost per patient, but we need to focus more on the cost per sustained viral response. We are willing to pay $60,000 with interferon and ribavirin for 48 weeks with a sustained response rate of 50%. So we were paying $120,000 per sustained viral response. If with the new drugs you had $120,000, it's almost the same cost per sustained viral response. And we'll see newer drugs dropping down. We're already hearing the discussions with the new drugs coming down in the range of $70,000 to $80,000 per patient. And in fact, the sustained viral response will be less per sustained viral response than what we've paid in the past. Another issue that I want to address is the very important aspect of slow to approve. Health Canada approved our first drugs, boceprevir and telaprevir, you can see, in July and August of 2011. The Canadian Drug Review reviewed those in October, and in the case of telaprevir in February of 2012. There's a long lag between the time Health Canada approves and our Canadian Drug Review has an opportunity to get to these drugs. I think in some examples of clearly breakthrough drugs, that should be shortened. And from the time they're approved by the Canadian Drug Agency, you can see how the provinces stepped up to start approving the drugs. And even Alberta, the resource-rich Alberta, was the 8th province to approve the new drugs. And it wasn't until December of 2012, November and December of 2012, we approved the addition of these protease inhibitors. We need to find a way to shorten the difference, the time between Health Canada's approval, the Canadian Drug Review, and the time we get them onto Blue Cross. These are the steps: Health Canada approval, Canadian Drug Review recommendations, and then provincial approvals. Even with breakthrough drugs, the process is slow, the process is variable. This just shows that we don't expect every new drug to be used in every type of disease. The genotypes are extremely important. The cost of sustained viral responses with genotype 2, for example, with interferon ribavirin is $12,000 per sustained viral response. If you look at new drugs, rofavir and ribavirin, the cost would be $58,000. Obviously, there are some that we will still have to use, the less costly treatments, or go through them before you get access to the more important. What can we learn from HIV? HIV has had a very strong lobby. Patients, physicians around the world, HIV's had a lobby. The HCV lobby, again, is not quite as good. And we need to change it. We need to see how we can get, and the people in this room are people in Canada that should be taking on this challenge. We need to find a way to move this to similar to what's happened. What did the HIV lobby achieve? It achieved tremendous support, and now greater than 80% of the patients, 86% in this country, are on treatment, and the disease is dramatically changed. We talked, and there's a lot of talk of treatment as prevention, but this should be the area where hepatitis C is highly important, that we think about treatment as prevention. The disease is decreasing. I've shown you examples where if we treat the high transmitters, we screen and treat infants at birth or prevent that transmission vertically. There are a number of ways we can step forward and really reduce the HCV transmission, much like we've seen in HIV, but it requires an active group of people getting behind it, lobbying government, including patients, physicians, nurses, everyone. Treatment as prevention in hepatitis C, you can see that IV drug users, how rapidly we can decrease the transmission of this disease, potentially effective very quickly. Let us just do a little comparison with HIV and hepatitis C. We should be in a better position with hepatitis C than HIV for some of these efforts, because the antivirals are curative. Let me emphasize again, this is the first persistent viral infection that we've ever been able to cure. And HIV antivirals are suppressive. The cost is high. It's probably going to be $70,000 for a cure, but we don't think anything about putting patients, and everybody accepts you put patients with HIV on therapy. It's $10,000 a year, and it goes on lifelong, 20, 30 years. The numbers are higher in hepatitis C. It gives us a bigger challenge, but it should be a more exciting challenge to take on and do. We need a strategic plan. There's excellent strategic plans in HIV that are carried out by passionate people that have lobbied strong and hard, and we need to see strong teams development, passionate teams that we've seen in HIV. We need the same type of passionate teams in hepatitis C, and it needs to come out of this room. Goals for Canada, eradication is not a realistic goal, but elimination in Canada is. Eradication worldwide is not a realistic goal, I should have said. But in Canada, elimination is a stretch goal, but should be our goal. Control is the minimum goal we should be looking at. Worldwide, hepatitis C is different. The epidemic continues. There are 2.5 to 4 million people that still develop this disease every year. Treatment in many countries is simply unrealistic. Vaccine remains very critical to the long-term control of this disease on a worldwide basis. This is what it looks like worldwide. A few are diagnosed, a few are going to be cured, but the vast majority remain undiagnosed, untreated, and we need find a way. But in Canada, in our country, we should control or eliminate this disease. We have broad efficiency of the drugs. They're simple and safe and short durations, no resistance. We need a political and social agenda to make it happen, and the economics are not impossible. Conclusion, a call to action for people in this room. We need a strategic national plan. I think we're having one that's being developed, but let's see it and let's work with it. The goal in Canada should be elimination of HCV. We need to approve the new therapies more rapidly. Let me say, right now, I see in my clinic post-transplant patients desperate for the therapies. I see patients with cirrhosis, decompensated cirrhosis, desperate for the therapy. It is really critical and sinful that we have the therapies at hand and we've got to get them out and into these patients, particularly the cirrhosis and the decompensated cirrhosis and the post-transplant liver patients. We also need to treat the high transmitters very quickly. Cover the costs through private insurance, governments, plans, etc. Screen, seek, and treat people who use IV drugs, people in custodian settings, immigrants, Aboriginal populations, where we see probably 3 to 5% of the population infected already. The birth cohort, we need to seek, treat, and treat to prevent. Let's not forget about some forgotten populations. I think pediatric patients need to be quickly integrated into this because their disease is not as innocent as we once thought. There is a 26% higher rate of fibrosis and complications of liver disease in children with hepatitis C than the uninfected. Pregnancy to treat and prevent that new cohort coming in. I want to thank you very much. I want to thank again a number of people who I have borrowed slides from liberally and in this talk, but Jordan Feld, Mel Krasden, Steve Shafran, John Farley, Phil Jacobs, Jason Grebley, and Saul Carpin on the pediatric work. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. In case, I don't think it's pie in the sky. I think it is really something that we should take on as a challenge, and let us begin with the tools we have now and think about eliminating this disease in Canada. Thank you very much.